The boy walked into the most expensive rehabilitation center in Chicago on a Tuesday morning in November, wearing a jacket with a hole in the left elbow and shoes that had been resoled with electrical tape. And every single person in that building, the physical therapists in their pressed scrubs, the administrative staff behind their glass reception desk, the private security guard who stood at the entrance of the Meridian Institute for Neurological Recovery like a sentinel at the gates of a world that cost $4,000 a day to access, looked at him and made the same immediate, automatic, deeply human mistake of deciding they already knew everything they needed to know about who he was and why he was there and what category of person he belonged to. They were wrong. They were wrong in a way that would take approximately 3 hours to become fully apparent, and in a way that would ultimately reshape the lives of 4 people in that building so completely that none of them would be able to explain afterward what their lives had looked like before that Tuesday morning in November, before a 12-year-old boy in a jacket with a hole in the elbow walked through a door that was not designed for people like him and changed everything that happened on the other side of it. His name was Marcus Ellis, and he had not come to the Meridian Institute by accident. He had come because of a boy in a wheelchair on the 14th floor whose name was Connor Whitmore, and because of something Marcus could do that no one in that building, not the therapists, not the neurologists, not the team of specialists that William Whitmore had flown in from 3 different countries at a combined cost that would have housed Marcus's entire neighborhood for a year, had been able to do in 11 months of trying. Marcus Ellis could make Connor Whitmore's legs move. He just hadn't told anyone that yet. Before we go to the 14th floor, before we go to the moment that the lead physical therapist at the Meridian Institute would later describe to a colleague as the single most unexpected clinical development I have witnessed in 22 years of neurological rehabilitation, we need to understand who Marcus Ellis was, because he was not what he appeared to be in the lobby of that building. And the distance between what he appeared to be and what he actually was is the most important distance in this entire story. He was 12 years old, 4 feet 10 inches tall, with dark brown skin and close-cropped natural hair, and eyes the color of deep water that moved constantly, registering everything, missing nothing. The eyes of someone who has lived in environments where missing things has consequences. He had been homeless, technically, for 14 months, since the previous September when his mother, Diane Ellis, had lost the apartment on the south side of Chicago that they had shared with Marcus's aunt and her 2 children, lost it in the specific cascading way that poverty loses things, one domino tipping the next. A missed shift leading to a reduced paycheck, leading to a late payment, leading to an eviction. Notice leading to a series of temporary arrangements that had grown progressively less stable, until Marcus and Diane were living out of a 2003 Honda Civic with a cracked windshield parked in rotating spots around the Inglewood neighborhood, managing the specific, invisible, exhausting logistics of homelessness, while Diane worked 2 jobs, and Marcus attended Robeson High School's middle school annex 5 days a week with the fierce, quiet determination of a boy who understood that school was the only fixed point in a geography that kept shifting. He was not a boy who explained himself. He had learned early, in the specific school of going without that teaches its lessons hard and fast, and without repetition. That explanation was a luxury, that most people had already decided what they were looking at before you opened your mouth, and that the most efficient use of his energy was not changing their minds, but finding the people who were actually paying attention and making himself useful to them. He was useful in ways that were not immediately visible. He read at a level that his teachers, when they tested him, described with the specific vocabulary of educational assessment as significantly above grade level, which was their way of saying that Marcus Ellis, in a reading comprehension test designed for 8th graders, had scored in the 97th percentile at the age of 11, without ever having had a consistent place to store books, without a desk or a room or a bedside lamp. Reading instead on his phone with the screen brightness turned low to save battery, on park benches and in library reading rooms and in the back seat of the Civic, while his mother drove between jobs. He was also, and this was the thing that nobody in his school or his neighborhood or his life had yet found the right container for E. Extraordinarily gifted in the specific domain of human movement. Not athletic movement, though he was that too. Something more precise. He could watch a person move and see, with the specific clarity of someone whose perception in this domain operated at a frequency most people couldn't access, exactly what was wrong and exactly what was needed. He had been doing it since he was 7 years old and had watched his grandmother recovering from hip surgery and had told her with 7-year-old directness, "Grandma, you're compensating with your left side. Your right hip is leading, but your pelvis isn't following." His grandmother had told her physical therapist what Marcus said. The physical therapist had evaluated her gait and adjusted the therapy plan. The recovery had accelerated noticeably. The physical therapist had asked carefully who had made that observation. Diane had said, "My son." The physical therapist had said, "How old is your son?" Diane had said, "7." The physical therapist had not said anything for a moment. Then she had said that observation was correct. The connection to Connor Whitmore had begun, as unlikely connections sometimes begin, through the specific geography of proximity and attention. Marcus had been spending his after-school hours for the past 2 months at the Harold Washington Library on State Street in the Loop, which was warm and had Wi-Fi, and permitted him to stay until closing without requiring anything of him, except the specific invisible behavior he had mastered. The art of existing in a space without drawing the kind of attention that results in being asked to leave. He had been sitting in the library's young adult section on a Thursday afternoon in September, reading a medical journal article on neuroplasticity that he had found through a search that had begun as curiosity and extended into 3 hours of reading, when a woman had sat down in the chair across the study table from him and had begun to cry. Not loudly, the quiet, contained crying of someone who has been holding something for a very long time and has run out of the energy required to keep holding it. Marcus had looked at her. She was white, well-dressed in the understated way of people for whom expensive things look like simplicity, somewhere in her early 40s, with the specific hollowed exhaustion of someone who has been fighting something for a long time and is not sure anymore that the fighting is working. She had a manila folder of medical documents in front of her. The top page, which Marcus could read upside down with no difficulty, showed the letterhead of the Meridian Institute for Neurological Recovery and the words spinal cord injury and a patient name, Connor Whitmore, age 9. He had offered her a tissue from the travel pack he kept in his jacket pocket, one of the practical small supplies he maintained with the organized resourcefulness of someone who has learned that preparedness is the only reliable substitute for infrastructure. She had accepted it. She had looked at him, expecting to see a child, and finding instead whatever it is that people find when they look at Marcus Ellis closely enough to actually see him. She had said in the automatic way of people who need to explain themselves, "I'm sorry, my son, he was in an accident." Marcus had nodded. She had said, "They're saying he won't," and she had not finished the sentence. Marcus had looked at the medical document visible through the folder cover. He had said, "Can I ask you something?" She had said, "Sure." He had said, "What level is the injury?" She had stared at him. He had said, "The spinal cord injury." "What level?" She had said slowly, "T6, thoracic 6. He had been quiet for a moment, the specific quiet of someone running calculations. He had said, "That's incomplete." She had looked at him for a long time. She had said, "They think so. The imaging is not entirely clear." He had said, "Then he should be able to feel something below the level of injury, heat or pressure or some sensation, even if movement is very limited," she said. "He says he feels things sometimes, tingling. But the therapists say it might be phantom sensation," Marcus had said, "or it might not be." She had looked at him the way people look at Marcus Ellis when he says things that land like that, with the expression of someone recalibrating who they are talking to. She had said, "Who are you?" He had said, "Marcus." She had said, "How old are you, Marcus?" He had said, 11. He had just turned 11 the previous week. she had said with the quiet of someone deciding something, "I'm Catherine." Catherine Whitmore. Catherine Whitmore was the wife of William Whitmore, which meant she was the wife of the founder and CEO of Whitmore Capital Group, one of the largest private equity firms in the Midwest, with assets under management in excess of $12 billion and a portfolio that included real estate, manufacturing, and a technology infrastructure division that had expanded aggressively over the previous 5 years. William Whitmore was, by the measurement of the world that measures these things, extraordinarily powerful and extraordinarily wealthy, and he had spent the 11 months since his son Connor's accident spending that wealth and deploying that power with a focus and a desperation that would have been recognizable to any parent in his situation, regardless of their resources. He had engaged the best spinal cord injury specialists in the country, had flown in consultants from rehabilitation centers in Switzerland and Japan, had funded a specific research inquiry at Northwestern University's neurology department into incomplete thoracic spinal cord injuries in pediatric patients, and had installed Connor in the Meridian Institute, the finest private neurological rehabilitation facility in Chicago, perhaps in the Midwest, where a team of 12 specialists worked with his son 6 hours per day, 5 days a week, with the specific, sustained, evidence-based intensity of the most advanced rehabilitation medicine available. Connor had shown minimal functional recovery. He could feel sensation in areas where the injury's classification suggested sensation might be present, but 11 months of intensive therapy had produced only the most marginal improvements in voluntary movement below the level of injury. Improvements so small that the lead therapist, a woman named Dr. Patricia Sena, had begun, carefully and with great compassion, to prepare the Whitmore family for a conversation about long-term disability management rather than functional recovery. William Whitmore had not accepted that conversation. He was not, by nature or by practice, a man who accepted conclusions he had not reached himself, and the conclusion that his 9-year-old son would not walk was a conclusion he refused to reach, which was simultaneously the most understandable thing about him and the source of considerable friction with the clinical team at the Meridian, who were doing their best work and needed the family to be their partner in realistic expectation setting. Catherine Whitmore sat between these two realities, her husband's refusal and the clinical team's growing certainty, and absorbed the pressure of both, which was what she had been doing when she sat down across from Marcus Ellis in the Harold Washington Library on a Thursday afternoon in September and started to cry. She had not told William about Marcus immediately. She had gone home that evening and thought about the 11-year-old boy in the library who had asked about injury level and completeness classifications with the fluency of someone who had read the literature. And she had thought about what he had said about the tingling sensations Connor reported. And she had thought about the specific quality of attention he had brought to a folder of medical documents he could read only upside down from across a table. She had gone back to the library the following Thursday. Marcus had been there. They had talked for 2 hours about Connor, about the injury, about neuroplasticity and incomplete injury classification, and the specific therapeutic modalities that research suggested were most effective for pediatric thoracic SCI patients. Marcus had brought his phone and had pulled up journal articles to support the things he was saying, and Catherine had sat across the table from an 11-year-old boy in a jacket with a hole in the elbow, and had listened to him cite research with a precision that her husband's team of specialists had not consistently matched, and she had felt, for the first time in 11 months, something she had almost forgotten how to feel, something adjacent to hope. She had gone back a third time, and a fourth. Over 6 weeks of Thursday library sessions, she had told Marcus everything. The specific details of Connor's injury, the imaging results, the therapy protocols, the marginal improvements, the conversations with Dr. Sena. Marcus had listened to all of it and had asked questions that were, without exception, precise and relevant, and occasionally the kind of question that caused Catherine to say, "I don't know. let me ask the team, and then come back the following Thursday with the answer. He had built in those 6 Thursday sessions a more complete understanding of Connor Whitmore's specific clinical situation than most people outside the treatment team possessed. And he had developed, in his composition notebook, the one he kept in his backpack with his library card and his phone charger and the practical small supplies, a framework for thinking about Connor's therapy that was different from what the Meridian's team was doing, different in a way that Marcus could explain and Catherine could follow, and that was grounded in the same research literature the clinical team used but approached from a different angle, the angle of someone who had a SPI. And 5 years watching how bodies actually move rather than how textbooks say they should. He had told Catherine on the 6th Thursday what he thought Connor needed to try. She had been quiet for a long time. She had said, "You're 12 now, right?" He had said, "Yes." She had said, "Marcus, what you're describing, this approach to sensory motor integration, our team has been doing something similar, but your framework is more specific." He had said, "I know." She had said, "How do you know this?" He had said, with the simplicity that was his default register for important things, "I've been watching people move my whole life and I've been reading about it for 2 years. I don't know if I'm right about Connor. I'd need to see him." She had looked at him for a long moment. She had said, "Then come see him." Which was why Marcus Ellis walked into the Meridian Institute for Neurological Recovery on a Tuesday morning in November, wearing a jacket with a hole in the left elbow. Catherine had arranged it as a visitor, had not told William in advance, had not told the clinical team in advance, had told the front desk that she was bringing a family friend to visit her son, and had left it at that. Because she understood, with the specific pragmatic intelligence of a woman who had spent 15 years navigating the world adjacent to significant power, that the conversation about who Marcus was and what he was doing there would go much better after whatever happened in Connor's room than before it. The security guard at the entrance had looked at Marcus with the expression Marcus had seen 1,000 times. The expression of someone completing a sentence about him that they had started before he walked in, and had been about to say something when Catherine had put her hand on Marcus's shoulder and said to the guard, with the pleasant specificity of someone who is not asking for permission, "He's with me." They had gone upstairs. Connor Whitmore was 9 years old and had been 9 years old for 3 months, having turned 9 in August. 2 months before the accident that had happened in October of the previous year. A car accident on Lake Shore Drive, a wet road, a moment of miscalculation that had lasted less than a second and had rearranged the Whitmore family's reality permanently. He was small for his age, with his father's dark hair and his mother's eyes, and he had the specific emotional landscape of a child who has been very sick for a long time, a layered quality, simultaneously older than his years and very young, the specific combination of resilience and exhaustion that serious illness produces in children who have no choice but to carry it. He spent his days in his room on the 14th floor of the Meridian in a powered wheelchair, doing his schoolwork on a tablet, attending therapy sessions that he participated in with cooperative determination, even when they produced little visible result. Because he was, at his core, the kind of child who tried. He had been told, in the careful language that adults use with children to convey difficult truths without complete directness, that recovery was uncertain, that everyone was working very hard, that there was reason to hope. He understood more than the adults thought he understood. Children who have been very sick for a long time generally do. Marcus walked into Connor's room and Connor looked at him the way children look at other children in environments that are full of adults, with immediate, uncomplicated recognition and interest, without the layers of assessment and category assignment that adults bring. He said, "Hi." Marcus said, "Hi." Catherine stood near the door. Marcus put his backpack on the chair near the window and looked at Connor with the specific quality of attention that was the most remarkable thing about him. The complete, technical, utterly unsentimental attention of someone reading a body the way other people read text. He was quiet for almost a full minute. Connor watched him, Catherine watched Marcus. Marcus walked around the wheelchair slowly, looking at the way Connor was seated, the position of his hips, the angle of his spine, the placement of his feet on the footrests, the specific small postural signals that a body gives about what it can and cannot do. Then he crouched down to Connor's eye level and said, "Can you feel this?" He placed 2 fingers on the back of Connor's right calf with light pressure. Connor said, "Kinda, it's fuzzy." Marcus nodded. He moved his fingers to a different point. Connor said, "That one I can feel better." Marcus moved again. Connor said, "That one's clearest." Marcus stood up. He looked at Catherine. He said, "The sensation mapping is more organized than the team thinks. The pathways aren't gone, they're suppressed." He said it with the calm specificity of someone stating what the evidence shows rather than what they hope. Catherine said quietly, "How do you know?" He said, "Because of which points he can feel and which ones he can't. The pattern isn't random. It follows the intact pathways." He reached into his backpack and produced his composition notebook and showed her a diagram he had drawn, a simplified spinal pathway map with markings that corresponded precisely to the sensation points he had just tested. Catherine looked at the diagram for a long time. She said, "Marcus." He said, "I know." What happened in the next 2 hours in Connor's room was something that the clinical team would spend considerable time afterward trying to categorize. Marcus had sat on the floor beside Connor's wheelchair and had begun, with a patience and a precision that were equally remarkable, guiding Connor through a series of movements and sensation exercises that were not standard therapy protocols, but were grounded in the same neuroscience that standard therapy protocols were grounded in, approached from the angle of someone who thought about bodies in motion rather than bodies in clinical frameworks. He talked to Connor the whole time, not in the careful, managed language of therapeutic professionals, but in the direct, specific peer language of one child talking to another, explaining what he was doing and why in terms that Connor could follow and respond to. He had Connor close his eyes and attend to specific sensations. He had Connor attempt movements not as commands to his limbs, but as intentions directed at specific muscle groups. He worked from the sensation map he had developed, targeting the areas where Connor's perception was clearest, building from there outward. He did not promise anything. He did not perform optimism. He simply worked, quietly and precisely, for 2 hours. And at 1 hour and 47 minutes, while Marcus had his hands on Connor's right knee joint and was guiding a specific sensory motor integration exercise, Connor's right foot moved. Not reflexively, not the involuntary spasm that incomplete SCI patients sometimes experience. Deliberately, slowly, but deliberately. Connor felt it happen and looked down at his foot and looked up at Marcus, and his face did the thing that 9-year-old faces do when something impossible has just become briefly, tentatively possible. It opened completely, every layer of protection gone, just a child and a moment and the specific, enormous thing the moment contained. He said in a voice that was very small, "Did you see that?" Marcus said. "I saw it." He said it the way you say something you have been working toward, not surprised exactly, but deeply, quietly satisfied. He said, "Do you want to try again?" Catherine had called William from the corridor outside Connor's room, where she had gone when the foot moved because she needed a moment that was not in front of the boys. She had called him and he had been in a meeting, and his assistant had put her through immediately because Catherine did not call during meetings, and when she did it meant something. She had said on the phone, in a voice that was not crying but was very close, "William, you need to come here. You need to come here right now." He had said, "Is Connor okay?" She had said. Connor moved his foot. There was a silence on the line. He said, "Catherine," she said, deliberately, not a spasm. He moved it deliberately. "William, you need to come here." He had left the meeting. He had been at the Meridian in 22 minutes, which was faster than the drive should have taken, which indicated something about the speed at which he had covered the distance between his office and his car. He arrived at the 14th floor and walked into Connor's room and found his son in his wheelchair and a 12-year-old boy he had never seen sitting on the floor beside the chair, and his son was moving his right foot, slowly, with effort, with the specific concentrated intensity of someone doing something that requires every unit of available focus, but moving it, voluntarily. William Whitmore stood in the doorway of his son's hospital room and watched this for approximately 30 seconds without speaking. And in those 30 seconds, something happened in his face that was not something William Whitmore typically permitted to happen in his face. Something broke open, or perhaps broke down, or perhaps simply became honest in a way that was usually managed. He looked at Marcus. Marcus looked at him. Connor said, "Dad, Marcus is helping me." William said, "I see that." He said it to Connor. Then he looked at Marcus again and said, "Who are you?" Marcus said, "Marcus Ellis." William said, "How old are you?" Marcus said, 12. William was quiet. He said, "How did you know what to do?" Marcus looked at him with the direct, unsentimental attention he brought to everything and said, "I've been reading about it for 2 years and I've been watching how people move for longer than that. I looked at Connor's sensation map and understood where the intact pathways were." William said, "You developed a sensation map," Marcus said. "In the last 2 hours, yes." William looked at Catherine, who was standing near the window with the expression of someone who has been carrying a secret that has just been allowed to stop being a secret. He looked back at Marcus. He said, "Where do you go to school?" Marcus said, "Robeson." William said, "On the south side." Marcus said, "Yes." William said, "Did you drive here?" He was asking who had brought him, was asking in his indirect, powerful person way about Marcus's circumstances. And Marcus understood the question and answered the real one rather than the surface one. He said, "I took the bus." He said it simply and completely without either embarrassment or performance, the way you state a fact that is simply a fact. William looked at him for a long moment. He said, "Marcus, I'd like to talk to you. Can you come with me?" Marcus glanced at his backpack, then at Connor, then at Catherine, who gave him the smallest nod. He said, "Okay." They went to a family consultation room down the corridor. William, Catherine, and Marcus, and William Whitmore, who had spent 11 months in rooms full of the most credentialed specialists his considerable fortune could assemble, sat across a consultation room table from a 12-year-old boy in a jacket with a hole in the elbow and said, "Tell me everything you know." And Marcus told him. He told him about the sensation mapping and the pathway analysis and the specific approach to sensory-motor integration he had developed from the research literature and from his own observation. He pulled out his composition notebook and showed William the diagrams and the framework he had built over 6 weeks of Thursday library sessions. He was precise and complete and said, "I don't know where he didn't know and the research suggests, where he was working from evidence rather than certainty." And William Whitmore, who could identify competence because he had spent his adult life hiring and deploying it, listened to this 12-year-old boy with the same focused attention he brought to his most important business discussions, because he understood, with the specific clarity that sometimes arrives when something has become sufficiently important, that what he was listening to was real. When Marcus finished, William said, "I want Dr. Sina to hear this." Marcus said, "Okay," William said, "and I want to know about you, not about Connor, about you, where you live, what you need." Marcus was quiet for a moment. He said, "That's a different conversation." William said, "I know, I'd like to have it." Marcus said, "Why?" William said, "Because what you just did for my son this morning is worth more to me than anything I own. And I would like to understand who you are." Marcus looked at him across the consultation room table and said, with the careful, precise honesty of someone who has learned to mean everything he says, "I live in a car, me and my mom, on the south side. She works 2 jobs. We've been doing it for 14 months. He said it without apology and without performance, and without the specific inflation or deflation that people sometimes apply to their circumstances when they're in rooms with powerful people. He just said it the way he said everything the way it was. William Whitmore held his gaze. He said quietly, "Thank you for telling me." He said it the way you say something when you mean it completely. Dr. Patricia Sina was called to the consultation room. She arrived expecting a family meeting, and found instead a family meeting that also contained a 12-year-old boy with a composition notebook full of clinical diagrams. And she sat down with the specific careful expression of a professional who is prepared to be politely skeptical. And then, as Marcus walked her through the sensation mapping, and the pathway analysis and the framework for sensory motor integration, her expression moved through several phases, polite attention, sharpening interest, genuine engagement, and then something that Dr. Patricia Sena, who had 22 years in neurological rehabilitation and was not given to dramatic responses, would later describe to a colleague as the specific feeling of watching a mind that operates in a register I did not expect. She examined Marcus's sensation mapping documentation. She compared it to the clinical data in Connor's file. She asked 3 technical questions. Marcus answered all 3 correctly and completely. She said, looking at the composition notebook diagram, "This notation system, where did you develop this?" Marcus said, "I made it up to track the patterns." She said, "It's consistent with established pathway mapping conventions." He said, "I know. I looked them up to make sure I was tracking the right things." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "Marcus, the movement you produced in Connor's foot this morning, I'd like to understand exactly what you were doing when it ate." "A pen." He walked her through it step by step. She listened. She took notes. She said at the end to William, "I want to run a full sensory evaluation on Connor using this mapping as a baseline, and I want to incorporate elements of what Marcus is describing into the therapy protocol for the next 4 weeks. If what I'm seeing in this notebook is reflected in the clinical evaluation, we may need to significantly revise our assessment of Connor's recovery potential." She looked at Marcus. She said, "Will you come back?" He said, "Yes." That mistake of writing Marcus Ellis off in the lobby of the Meridian Institute on a Tuesday morning in November cost the clinical team 11 months. Not their fault. They had never seen him, never been given the chance to be wrong about him. But the moment they saw him clearly, the moment they listened to what he actually knew, the timeline of Connor Whitmore's recovery changed. The revised sensory evaluation, conducted 3 days after Marcus's first visit, confirmed the pathway organization Marcus had identified. The updated therapy protocol, incorporating Marcus's sensory-motor integration framework, was implemented the following week. 6 weeks later, Connor Whitmore could move both feet voluntarily, with increasing range and decreasing effort. 10 weeks after that, he could move his legs. The recovery that the clinical team had begun to frame as unlikely became, in the language of the NTSB-style incident report that Dr. Sena filed with the Meridian's medical board, a significant and unexpected improvement in functional outcome attributable to a revised therapeutic approach initiated following an external observation. She had wanted to name Marcus in the report. William had told her to wait, not because he wanted to obscure Marcus's contribution, but because he wanted to make sure that when Marcus was named, it was in a context that protected him rather than exposed him. He was 12 years old. He needed protecting. The conversation about Marcus's circumstances, the one William had called a different conversation in the consultation room, happened over the course of several meetings with both Marcus and Diane Ellis. Meetings that William Whitmore approached with the specific, careful humility of a man who understood that he was dealing with a situation that money could help, and that money alone could not fix. And that the person across the table from him was not in need of charity so much as in need of the kind of structural support that should have been available and had not been. He did not offer Marcus's family a gift. He offered them, through his legal team and in consultation with Diane Ellis about what she actually wanted, a combination of things. A stable housing arrangement in a good school district on the north side, funded through a trust established for that purpose. A scholarship arrangement for Marcus at the Illinois Mathematics and Science Academy, the state's specialized high school for gifted students in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, which Marcus was more than eligible for, and which Williams Foundation funded in a general capacity and could specifically support. And a research mentorship arrangement through Northwestern University's neurology department, where Marcus would work with actual neuroscientists on actual research problems, under the supervision of people who understood what they were looking at, and would give it the proper container. He had discussed all of this with Dr. Sena first, to make sure the research component was real rather than performative. She had said with her characteristic precision, If you put Marcus Ellis in a serious research environment with proper mentorship, the question is not whether he will contribute something significant. The question is how long it will take. William had said, "How long do you think?" She had said, "Not long." Diane Ellis had wept when William explained the full scope of what was being offered. Not from gratitude, exactly, though gratitude was part of it, but from the specific overwhelming quality of having carried something very heavy for a very long time and having someone finally actually help you set it down. She had wept and then she had dried her eyes and she had said, with the directness that Marcus had clearly inherited from her, "I want to understand all of this before I agree to any of it. I want my own lawyer to review whatever is being proposed." William had said, "Of course, I'll have my office facilitate that," she had said, "and I need you to understand something. My son helped your son because he wanted to help your son, not because he wanted anything in return. He didn't know who you were." William had said, "I know that. That's actually the reason I want to do this." She had looked at him for a long moment. She had said, "Okay." Marcus had his own meeting with William, separately, at the Whitmore family's home on the North Shore, a house of the kind that Marcus had only previously seen in photographs, with a lakefront view and an entrance hall bigger than the apartment on the south side had been in its entirety. He had walked through it with the same careful, registering attention he brought to everything, noting without dwelling. Connor had been there, in his wheelchair, which by that point was something Connor was using less and less as his mobility continued to recover in the steady, dramatic, unprecedented by the clinical team arc that had begun on a Tuesday morning in November. Connor had shown Marcus the foot movement, the full range of it, both feet now, with the proud, specific pride of a child showing someone he trusts the evidence of his own effort. Marcus had watched and nodded and said, "Your left is stronger than your right now, that's good." Connor had said, "Dr. Sina says I might walk by spring." Marcus had said, "I think before spring." Connor had looked at him. He had said, "Really?" Marcus had said, "The rate of progress in the last 6 weeks suggests before spring." Connor had been quiet for a moment. He had said, "Marcus, thank you." Marcus had looked at him. He had said, "You did the work. I just helped you understand where the pathways were." Connor had said, "That's what Dr. Sina says too." Marcus had said, "She's right." Connor had said, "She also says you're a genius." Marcus had said with the complete absence of self-consciousness that was one of the most remarkable things about him, "I'm not a genius. I read a lot and I pay attention." Connor had said, "That's kind of what a genius is." Marcus had thought about it. He had said, "Maybe." He had said, "You want to try something?" Connor had said, "Yes." And they had worked for another hour, the 9-year-old in the wheelchair and the 12-year-old on the floor beside him, one teaching and one learning, and both of them, in the specific and complete way of people who have found each other across an improbable distance, doing exactly what they were supposed to be doing. Connor Whitmore took his first steps in February, which was before spring, which Marcus had predicted. They happened in the physical therapy gym on the 14th floor of the Meridian Institute, with Dr. Sina and 2 members of the therapy team present, and with Catherine Whitmore standing near the wall with both hands over her mouth, and William Whitmore standing beside her with his hand on her shoulder and his jaw set in the specific way of a man trying to contain something very large, and with Marcus Ellis sitting, cross-legged on a therapy mat in the corner of the room watching with the quiet, satisfied expression of someone watching a consequence they understand completely. Connor took 3 steps with the parallel bars. He stopped. He looked at Marcus. Marcus said from the corner, 2 more. Connor took 2 more. He stopped. He looked at Marcus again. Marcus said, "Good, just that." Just the one word in the way Marcus said important things, the way it was, no more, no less. Connor laughed. He laughed the complete, unguarded, 9-year-old laugh of someone who has just done something they were told they might never do. And the sound of it in that physical therapy gym was the most important sound any of them had ever heard. And William Whitmore made no attempt whatsoever to contain what happened in his face when he heard it. And Catherine did not try to contain what happened in hers. And Dr. Sina, who had 22 years in this field and had seen many things, turned toward the window for a moment, and stayed there for a few seconds before she turned back, her expression precisely composed, her eyes not precisely dry. Marcus watched all of it from the therapy mat in the corner with his composition notebook in his lap. And when Connor looked at him across the room with the open, complete, entirely unself-conscious face of a child who is happy and wants the person responsible for the happiness to know it, Marcus looked back at him and gave him the smallest nod, the nod of someone who has done what they came to do, who knows what it cost and what it was worth, who needs no larger acknowledgement than this specific moment in this specific room, who carries within him, at 12 years old, the particular knowledge that the most important things you will ever do will often be done in circumstances that don't look like the setting for important things, in jackets with holes in the elbow, in libraries on Thursday afternoons, on therapy mats in corners of rooms, in the quiet, unremarkable, utterly consequential space between one person paying attention and another person being seen.